All right. Well, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. I know people will filter in here as we move along, but appreciate everyone for being here. So thanks to everyone for joining us for our quarterly town hall. I'm Chris Martin, our policy director here at Housing California. We're excited to be here discussing the state budget outlook, the federal outlook, as well as some highlights from the legislative session so far, alongside of our excellent partners with us today. Quickly, a few housekeeping items. We will take questions after each section once the presenter is finished. So please make sure to add any questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom, not the chat. We won't be monitoring the chat, so please be sure to add those questions to the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll try to get it to as many as we possibly can. And as well as you can always follow up with us after this, and we'll try and get your questions answered. It's our agenda today, and then for speakers today. So we have a wonderful group of speakers today, including some staff from the legislature and then some partners at the federal and state level. I'll let them each introduce themselves when they begin. But thanks again to everyone for being here with us today. And with that, I'll give it the mic over to Monica Davalos to get us started on the state budget.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Monica Davalos. I'm a senior policy analyst with the California Budget and Policy Center. The Budget Center is a research and analysis nonprofit that works to advance equitable budget decisions and state policies to really improve the lives of all Californians. And so today I'll be breaking down the major takeaways from the governor's proposed 2025-26 budget and what it means for Californians. So as we go through this conversation, a little bit too advanced. We're going forward instead of backward on our slides, but pretty much though, as we go through this conversation, it's really important to stay grounded that our state budget is really a statement of our values as these choices impact all Californians. So everything that we see, all the choices that are made really do have an everyday impact and should be really done very thoughtfully and should be scrutinized in certain ways. And so next slide, please. So beginning with some state context, the top line takeaway is that the proposed budget protects much of the progress made in recent years, but still falls short in fully funding critical services and programs. To dive into specifics, the governor's proposed budget for 2025-26 is roughly balanced, which is great. And this is partially due to last year's 2-year budget window that tackled the major shortfall, and those measures really helped balance this year's proposal. However, it's important to keep in mind that the proposed budget still falls short in certain ways in meeting the needs of struggling Californians, especially now that we face a harmful federal landscape. Roughly a third of our budget depends on federal funding, so upcoming federal cuts could pose serious challenges to our state budget. We also know that the state will need to continue to prioritize and support recovery from the devastating wildfires this year, which have longer-term budget implications as resources will be needed for rebuilding and supporting those impacted beyond the direct emergency response. Next slide, please. Importantly, what we don't see in the budget too are new ways to raise additional revenue to support new and expanded investments to continue making progress in ensuring Californians can afford the cost of living. And even the governor's administration, as well as the legislative analyst's office, have both projected that the state will face large deficits in future years without revenue increases or additional spending cuts. On the whole, the proposed budget includes $311 billion for 2025-26, and this is being spent on supports for a wide range of public services. And drilling down on our state's fiscal outlook, overall, as mentioned, the balance is roughly balanced. The budget is balanced for 2025-26. Which is great because it means we don't have a shortfall or a deficit as we saw in previous years. The governor projects a modest surplus of about $360 million for 2025-26. And when we zoom out a bit, The administration projects that general fund revenues for the 3-year budget window ending in 2025-26 will be up a little over 16 billion from the projection in last year's budget. So this is a good thing. And this is primarily due to higher personal income tax collections that helped boost the revenue that we're seeing now. However, revenue projections tend to be uncertain due to various external factors, including the market volatility, federal risks, as well as the extended tax filing deadline due to the LA wildfires. And this chart here just really highlights how much of our state's revenues comes from our progressive personal income tax rates. However, at the same time, because that is the largest chunk of our revenues, it is susceptible to additional volatility that's kind of outside of the state's control. Another key piece of the budget are our reserves as well as other tax policies. Last year, the budget included a $5 billion withdrawal from this budget stabilization account, also known as our state's rainy day fund, to help balance our budget. It also included a plan to withdraw an additional $7 billion this year, which is maintained. And so this would leave our rainy day fund with a balance of just under 11 billion. And part of this rainy day withdrawal, about 4.5 billion, was deposited into the state's main discretionary reserve, also known as the SFEU. Notably, though, on reserves is that there is no plan this year to replenish the safety net reserve, which was drained last year to help close the budget shortfall. And this reserve is really important because it was created specifically to hold funds to protect Medi-Cal as well as CalWORKs during economic downturns. And as I mentioned at the top, the proposed budget doesn't include proposals to significantly raise revenues for new and expanded investments, but we do see a few tax policy changes that are proposed by the governor, one of which is estimated to increase revenues, and the other would decrease revenue or really have little to no revenue impact. The two listed here, when kind of the impacts of these policies are taken together, they're estimated to modestly raise revenue by about 180 million in this current fiscal window. But in future years, that will likely turn into revenue losses, or the policies will roughly cancel each other out in terms of their revenue impact. I also wanted to quickly mention that the governor has made two reserve-related proposals, and these proposals would have to be approved by voters since they include changes to Proposition 4 from 1979, which is known as the gallon limit, and this created the state's spending cap. And Proposition 2 from 2014, which created additional rules around the rainy day fund. For the purposes of this, really what the governor is trying to do is increase the amount of money that we can save. So it would increase the size of the rainy day fund from 10% of our general fund revenues to 20%, as well as exclude any deposits from the state's spending cap. So any deposits wouldn't be counted towards our GAN limit. And it really makes sense as these deposits into our reserves are constitutionally required in order to ensure that the state has some savings. And so they really shouldn't be counted as saving in the first place, as when we face harder economic times, the state is able to draw those down and ensure like other protections around critical services and programs. So with all that said, what are the key takeaways from January? First and foremost is that the proposed budget protects much of the progress made in recent years, but really fails to take a bolder approach to adequately fund critical programs, especially related to affordable housing and homelessness, as you may hear from the panelists that come after me. But two is that the state's tax system and spending choices can be better at combating the glaring inequities that we're facing today in California. And as shown in this chart, we know that poverty is continuing to rise in California, and this is largely due to the expiration of federal pandemic era supports, but also just the overall increased cost of living that we're seeing and Californians are experiencing. And lastly is that there are certain questionable spending choices that threaten California's ability to really provide the supports that struggling California families need. And therefore, in preserving certain program levels, while it's critical and really great, and we were excited to see certain aspects of the budget, it's not sufficient to bring down the poverty rates and build the housing that we need. And aggressive investments that will require the state to raise new revenue and sustainable revenues to catch up from years of underfunding will be needed to ensure that all Californians have an affordable home and the ability to fully thrive. And with that, I think there's a short Q&A.
It looks like we have a few questions, and folks, feel free to throw some in the question and answer section below. Two of them I think are better for probably the next two speakers, but there's a question about the proposed change in bank taxation, in case you want to share a little bit more about that.
Yes, let me, 1 second.
While you're doing that, I'll mention for folks that I saw a couple questions about the slides being available. We will be sharing everything, including the recording, after this.
So on the bank piece, so the governor is essentially proposing to raise state revenues by changing how financial institutions would calculate their state taxes, which would include banks. But pretty much the change would result in tax cuts to banks and other financial institutions that have significant property and employees in California, and tax increases for those who have many California customers, but little physical footprint in the state. And so that change itself is estimated to raise about 330 million in 2025-26 and over 250 million annually. But given that this provision is estimated to raise revenues while we're doing other things like providing a film tax credit, that's why they essentially cancel each other out, because while we're bringing in money from one source, we're essentially not bringing money in from an additional source, if that makes sense. But
yeah. There's a question about the poverty rate that you mentioned, whether that was the actual poverty rate or the percentage change in poverty rate. They were trying to catch that on the slide.
that is a great question, and I can't get to my slide right now. Sorry. No, it's the overall poverty rate. And that's under the California Supplemental Poverty Measure, which takes into consideration specific factors around the cost of living in California.
Alrighty. Well, a lot of the questions that are on here are probably going to be answered with the next two speakers. So I may move us forward, and appreciate you, Monica, for giving us that overview, and appreciate all your work at the Budget Center. With
Thank
that,
you.
I will move us to Tim. And I noticed there's a hand raise. We unfortunately can't do hand raises and answers live questions. So please, if you have a question, try to put it in the Q&A. And with that, we're excited to have Tim Griffiths here from the Senate Budget Committee, and I will pass it over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks to Housing California for having me this morning. I'm pleased to be here. I'll do my best to kind of give an overview of the budget from a legislative perspective. I am Tim Griffiths with the Senate Budget Committee. I work on housing and homelessness and economic development issues. For obvious reasons, I'll focus on the housing and homelessness side of those things today. But so I will try to give the legislative perspective and in particular focus in on the housing and homelessness proposals from the governor and how the legislature may respond to those. We were hoping that my colleague from the Assembly, Genevieve Morellis, would also be able to join. She got pulled away, unfortunately, to other things and isn't able to join. So I promised her that I would start out by letting you all know that any problems that you have with the budget, they are entirely caused by the Assembly, not by the Senate, and you should take your complaints to her. I'm kidding. She's a wonderful resource, and her contact information will be I have on the slide at the end. And so you're hearing from primarily a Senate perspective here, but I'll do my best to sort of wrap in where I think, for the most part, over the last few years, the Senate and the Assembly have been in relative lockstep, at least as to sort of overall priorities on housing and homelessness. So I can't speak for her, but I hopefully will give some sense of what you can expect from a broader legislative perspective. So moving directly to the 2025-26 housing budget as proposed by the governor in his January budget. And actually, before I do this, I wasn't sure whether Monica was going to cover this. Let me take a quick step back here and just lay out where we are in the overall budget process. Forgive me for those of you who are already really familiar with this, but I feel like it may be important context for some of you. The budget process annually in the state of California begins in January, at least for the bulk of it. The key focal point of the budget process starts in January when the governor releases his proposed budget for the year. That is what I will be describing. And then from the period from February to May, early June, the legislature takes a series of hearings through the budget subcommittees and sometimes the full budget committee takes hearings to consider each of those proposals, to provide some oversight over existing programs. And those ultimately lead to the legislature making some proposed changes to what the governor has proposed in his January budget. A negotiation ensues. Typically, it happens throughout this period, but the final negotiations happen in June, and that leads to a final budget which must be passed by June 15th of each year. So where we stand right now is that the governor has laid out the Jan 10th proposal, and that's what I'll go over momentarily with regard to housing and homelessness. And we're just at the beginning of the legislative hearings on those proposals. I encourage everyone to get involved in those hearings if you have important budget matters. And let me just say in that regard, in terms of scheduling, that on the Senate side, the subcommittee hearing, subcommittee 4 for the Senate Budget Committee, will have its hearings on housing budget proposals on February the 27th, the morning of February the 27th, and then follow up with proposals on homelessness, specifically on March the 13th. Again, the morning of March the 13th. Both of those will be in room 113. I don't have at my fingertips, I'm sorry, the dates for when the Assembly will have their budget hearings, but you will be able to find those on the Assembly Budget Committee's website. And again, I encourage everyone to give public comment, participate, to listen in on those hearings to get a sense of how all of this process is unfolding, and to have an opportunity to give your input on those proposals. Let's see. So now let me go back to the 2025-26 housing budget as proposed by the governor in the January 10th budget. I just want to highlight as we start that there are ongoing sources of appropriations, and sources of funding for affordable housing in the governor's budget. They aren't, but none of these are new sources or augmentations of sources. These are SB2, so the permanent local housing allocation funding. You have ASIC, the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Fund, that's funded through the Cap and Trade Program or the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, sometimes called GRF. I haven't done an analysis on whether there is any leftover bond money at this point for from prior housing bonds. If there is, it's just the very dregs at this point. So not much coming from there, if at all. There is money for the low-income housing tax credit program that is funded statutorily each year, and that is it adjusts with inflation. So this year's amount should be somewhere around 125 million, give or take, from statutory LIHTC. And then if you count it as a source of housing funding, there's, of course, the money for Home Key Plus coming from Proposition 1 that was approved by the voters last year, and for which NOFAs are out now from HCD. But what I want to highlight in particular is that there are no new sources or appropriations of funding for affordable housing development in the governor's January budget. And so I'll just put that out there. I think I can speak for the legislature. Well, I should never say that I can speak for the legislature. Let's put it this way. In the last few years, certainly making appropriations, financial support for affordable housing development has been a priority, and something that the legislature has tried to prioritize within the overall budget scheme. And certainly based on the conversations that I've heard around the Capitol, and that if for those of you who have seen the budget committee hearings thus far, you will hear the members continue to prioritize that, and to have expressed disappointment in the fact that the governor's Jan 10th budget does not include any augmentations and no new sources of funding for affordable housing. So if I can get the next slide, please. Then turning to the 2025-26, so the governor's January 10th proposed budget with regard to homelessness. Again, I just want to, I'm about to say that there are no or very few new sources or appropriations in this area. But I do want to highlight, of course, that there are some existing and ongoing sources and appropriations. Of course, those are the prior homelessness, HAP funding, HAP rounds. That's the homeless housing. I've got that written incorrectly on the slide. Forgive me. Prior homeless housing and assistance program rounds, prior encampment resolution fund rounds, and the prior family homelessness challenge grants. And of course, homelessness is not exclusively in the jurisdiction of HCD, the Housing and Community Development Department, where those three programs reside. As you're all well aware, there are other programs in other departments. But what I want to highlight here, even given that context, what is crucial, the sort of big takeaway, frankly, from the governor's January 10th budget is that there are very few new resources or appropriations proposed there for homelessness, for programs that address homelessness, certainly not for HAP. There is so no funding proposed, no new funding proposed for HAP, no round 7 in the governor's budget. I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in a second, but no funding proposed there for HAP. There is $100 million in the budget for the Encampment Resolution Fund that was agreed to as part of the 2-year deal that Monica alluded to earlier. So that's in some sense not new funding of any sort. It is the inclusion of funding that was previously agreed to. Otherwise, there is no new funding for these major programs that are intended to address homelessness in the state. And if I can get the next slide, please. So with that as the background, I want to sort of give you what I view as the outlook from here. I think the good news is you can probably imagine that I think it is fair to say that the governor's January budget is likely an opening negotiating position. In other words, that the governor is expecting the legislature to push back on and presumably to propose new and additional funding both in the affordable housing and homelessness arenas. And then there will be some negotiation and some compromise in June in accordance with the process I alluded to earlier. That can't be certain, but I think that's a fairly safe guess. In other words, that the governor is not completely closed to some of this funding, just is staking an opening position of zero in anticipation of further negotiation going forward. And then, as I alluded to earlier, the legislature has, at least in the last few years, pushed for housing and homelessness appropriations. And based on comments that you've probably heard members make thus far, I think it is fair to say that the legislature, both the Assembly and the Senate, are likely to push for additional funding, both in the housing and homelessness arenas, again, in this budget cycle. Here's the bad news. The January 10th budget was, when it was released, or just before it was released, came in the context of a feeling that after last year, which was chaotic based on trailing revenues, delays in revenue reporting, and this very significant deficit that we had to deal with, there was a feeling that we were coming in a comparatively stable situation, and that was sort of good news. But however, there have been, as you are all aware, sort of at least two major new sources of uncertainty and instability that have come up since January 10th. The first one, obviously, being the LA fires. But that's not just the question of the costs that the state may incur for addressing and remediating and providing assistance to those affected by the fires, but it also has to do with the fact that there have been extensions in the time period that folks in the LA area have to pay certain income taxes and that's going to affect the ability of the state to predict revenues in advance. The result of that is, again, just introduction of greater uncertainty into the process. That's going to make both the legislature and the governor's office more hesitant to make commitments early in the process. Commitments certainly to new spending, but just generally reticent to sort of firm up to make commitments early in the budget process. And then, of course, we have the issue that we were aware, of course, that the Trump administration would be coming in on January the 10th. But I think that it is fair to say that the degree to which the Trump administration has thus far felt free to, I was going to say tinker is too soft a word, to introduce mayhem on federal spending and how that flows to the states, has been more dramatic than anybody anticipated, or at least few people anticipated that. And that certainly introduces significant new uncertainty to our whole budget process. So that's going to complicate things. Both of those could result in much less money available for the state of California to spend, and therefore we would have to backfill in various places. That might reduce our ability to spend to make additional investments in the housing, even in the housing and homelessness areas, even though those have been priorities. It just depends. I'm not saying that those won't still be priorities. There are these major new uncertainties to consider. And as you're doing your advocacy, I would just bear all of that in mind. You're unlikely to get sort of you may get some pushback from members, or certainly some reticence or reluctance to commit to certain priorities, certainly early in the process. And part of that just is you just need to be aware that that's not necessarily a reflection of a lack of priority for these things, so much as deep uncertainty affecting the whole budget process. All right, next slide, please. So I wanted to just close by highlighting some specific issues related to the budget and the housing and homelessness budget in particular. First of all, I wanted to highlight that beyond just the question of appropriations of funding in the budget, the governor had stated on January 10th that he plans to do a reorganization of the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency, BCSH. And the governor indicated that he would do that through the Little Hoover Commission. So that's sort of a sidestep to the legislative process. I don't mean to suggest that they're doing that nefariously. That the Little Hoover Commission is one of its roles is to analyze government reorganization proposals. So it would be doing that in this case, and then the legislature will have the ultimate authority to either accept the proposal that comes through the Little Hoover Commission or to reject it. But initially, it'll be the Little Hoover Commission that will hold hearings on this reorganization. We know very little at this point about what that reorganization is going to look like. The administration has not presented the plan yet, and has been fairly tight-lipped, at least from any sources that I am familiar with, about what that reorganization will contain. At a minimum, what they have suggested is that it will be a division so there will be a housing and homelessness agency and a consumer protection agency that will be, and the BCSH will disappear. So at a minimum, it's just a split of those two agencies, but it could involve more significant reorganization of some of the housing and homelessness programs. You can imagine, for example, that they might take some of the programs that are currently housed in CDSS, the Department of Social Services, and that address homelessness, and in some fashion move those into this broader housing and homelessness agency. I don't know that that's what they're thinking. That's part of what may be possible. So if that structure is important to your organizations, then I strongly encourage you to be watching for that reorganization program to drop and to be engaging with the Little Hoover Commission initially on that. The second thing I want to point out is with regard to HAP, again, the Homeless Housing and Assistance Program. I had said before that there is no money in the governor's budget for a seventh round of HAP, so no new funding for HAP. That is true. However, I do want to highlight that the governor indicated an openness to discussing additional funding. He didn't say specific to HAP, so this could also apply to the Encampment Resolution Fund, for example, or other programs, state programs designed to address homelessness. But HAP is sort of the big elephant in the room here. It's been $1 billion annually for the last 4 years, I guess. So that would presumably be the figure that we would be thinking about for around 7. Anyway, the governor has indicated an openness to discussing funding the HAP program, but has made it clear that he has some prerequisites. And in particular, he wants to see before jurisdictions can get their HAP allowance, that they would be housing element compliant, that they would be compliant with the encampment dissolution procedures that the governor's office put out earlier this spring, or maybe it was last fall, and that they would at least to get some sort of priority for being a pro-housing designated jurisdiction. Those, I'm of course curious to hear anybody's thoughts on those, but those seem relatively straightforward to me. The one that is potentially more challenging is that the governor also indicated that he would like performance-based reallocation of funds to be part of any structure for a round 7 of HAP or for any additional homelessness funding, meaning that if a jurisdiction is not, it's a little bit unclear. The language is vague, but my takeaway is that if a particular jurisdiction is not meeting, is not improving on certain system performance measures, then they would lose some of their funding, and that funding would be then reallocated to one of the jurisdictions that is performing better. Exactly what that would look like is subject to further negotiation. If that is a point which I would encourage as much creative thinking, and if people have good ideas on how to meet what the governor has asked for, but in a way that doesn't punish unhoused folks for the performance of their local jurisdiction, that doesn't end up misallocating resources to places where there's lesser need and at the same time sending additional funding to places where there may be, sending more funding to where there's lesser need and vice versa. That is, I would say, maybe I'll just speak personally as a staffer on this rather than trying to speak for the members of the legislature. But I think we're looking for creative ways to be responsive to the governor's concern and at the same time avoid some of the potential pitfalls that I just described. So creative ideas very much welcomed. And then lastly, I want to say, just talk a little bit about the relevance of the pending housing bond bills. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Senator Cabaldon on the Senate side and Assemblymember Wicks on the Assembly side have introduced housing bonds that would be put before the electorate, put before the voters in the exact date of the election, not 100% clear, but presumably in November of this year or in the following year. These there's of course a risk that those bonds would they're both $10 billion bonds, if I'm not mistaken on the amounts, and they would send funding to a series of different affordable housing programs. I won't go into the details here, but encourage you to take a peek at that if you haven't already. Just in terms of the broader budget process, what I want people to be aware of is that, of course, there is just because the housing bond if it passes out of the legislature, that doesn't guarantee that it is passed by the voters, of course. And then second of all, even if those were to be passed by the voters, and so there is some new bond funding flowing into the affordable housing programs in the future, that funding won't become available until after the election takes place, and then after HCD can begin administration of that funding. So we're talking about at least a year, probably more like 2 years down the pike. All of that means that I think it is important that members of the legislature are aware that passage of the housing bond bills, while that might be a very good thing, is not an immediate solution to and does not immediately address the lack of affordable housing investments in the governor's January 10th budget. That is still something that if they are indeed wish to make affordable housing a priority, a budget priority, then some additional investments and appropriations may be necessary in that area in this year's budget, in the 2025 Budget Act. Forgive me, I realized I just skipped over one thing with regard to HAP, so let me step back there and then I will close. I also want to bring to people's attention what I think is an issue framing challenge with regard to additional funding for HAP. If you've been listening to any of the budget hearings, there is, and listen to some of the questions that the members have asked, it seems clear that there's something of a perception that there is still a lot of available HAP money out there. Members have asked, for example, well, have jurisdictions received all of their round 5 money already? What is the status of round 6, which is of course still out for application at this stage? So as a result of that, I think there may be some perception amongst members that there's less of a need for additional HAP funding because there's this sort of stack up of HAP funding waiting to be dispersed. So just from a perspective of you all as stakeholders, I would encourage you to talk to your members about how the absence of money or new HAP money in the governor's budget proposal does still have impacts in terms of longer term planning for addressing homelessness at the local level, and in terms of how it's going to affect the ability of various organizations to continue this work, local governments and the nonprofits that are working on their contracts there. I hope that makes sense. That's just a perception issue and a challenge that for those of you who are interested in in trying to convince the legislature to prioritize additional HAP funding, you need to be aware of that current perception. And again, if it's something that you wish to push, then that's a narrative that you'll need to respond to. Okay, I have spoken a lot. Forgive me. I think we're now on to questions. You have happy to take questions now. Also, please feel free to contact me at any time. There's my contact information. But much more importantly, ask all of your questions and address your main complaints to my colleague Genevieve Morelos at the Assembly Budget Committee. Again, just kidding.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate all that helpful information. I did see a lot of questions in the chat again about the federal government. So I just want to remind folks our next speaker is going to talk about the federal side of things. But with that, I thought I'd ask, relatedly, Tim, if you could speak to the early action that the legislature took as it relates to both the federal government, the protections for the state and quote unquote Trump proofing the state, and if there's anything you could share there about some of the actions taken early on.
Sure. I think the main thing to know, and I forgive me for giving this caveat, but this is so the funding was the primary early action was funding of $25 million, if I am not mistaken, and it went principally to the Attorney General's office for the purpose of being able for supporting lawsuits, both defending the state of California and proactively bringing litigation against the federal administration to be able to respond to unconstitutional, unlawful, or otherwise problematic actions that the federal government might take that would have an impact on the state of California. So I think that's important for people to know that there is that funding available and that the state is attempting to be proactive about being responsive to what the federal government is up to. The caveat was simply that because I don't handle the AG's budget, I haven't been in the weeds of this particular proposal, but that's the broad outlines of it. And there was also funding in there to assist in the early action to assist to provide an investment in nonprofit legal services for folks who may be in the unauthorized or undocumented community and who might be the target of immigration enforcement action. I believe that was everything that was in that early action. If I've missed anything, invite others, Monica, or if you're still there, or Chris to jump in if you think I missed something.
As far as I know, I think you got it. Maybe two more questions. So, one of them's less of a question and more of a request. If you could reiterate, I know you mentioned some dates, I think for some hearings. If either you could reiterate those now or throw them in the chat.
Yeah, I will reiterate them, and then when I'm done doing my talking, I'll stick them in the chat. Forgive my limited multitasking capacities. So Senate, the Senate Budget Subcommittee that handles housing and homelessness issues has the fancy title of General Government, what is it, like State Government and General Administration. It feels like the miscellaneous category, but we handle housing and homelessness. And so that's subcommittee 4. And our primary hearing on housing issues will be the morning of February 27th in room 113 of the state capitol. It will begin immediately after the Senate floor session adjourns. So I expect that to be roughly 9:30 or 10 o'clock. And then we will hold a hearing on the homelessness programs that I spoke about earlier, and sort of the state investments to address homelessness more generally on March the 13th, again in room 113, again immediately upon the adjournment of the Senate floor session. I'll put those in the chat momentarily, and I'll try to look up the corresponding assembly subcommittee dates so I can put those in the chat as well. I don't know them off the top of my head. I'll try to put them in the chat. You can also find them on the Assembly Budget Committee's website.
Thanks, Tim. And maybe one last one for you. Just if you could share what, as far as you know, what the most important, performance measures are that the governor has been talking about.
Okay, so there are you're going to have to forgive me for not being able to rattle these off the top of my head, but there are a series of system performance measures. These were, I believe, were established by at the federal level initially, but they have been adapted for state use, and they are within they sit within now the statutes governing the administration of the HAP program. They are things like number of people falling into homelessness within the last year, the period of the time that somebody is in unsheltered homelessness, um, and there are a series of others. They're just system performance measures that are intended, designed to capture how well a jurisdiction is doing in terms of addressing homelessness within that area. Maybe I can try to pull those and also stick those in the chat in a second. Forgive me for not being able to rattle them off the top of my head. But the bottom line is they are statutorily prescribed. I don't know that the governor will be harping on those, and that those will be the basis for the reallocation. He did not say as much in his in the government in the written budget proposal. But those would be obvious because they are the system performance measures for the HAP program right now. They would be obvious things on which to potentially reallocate funding. Certainly, if people have alternative proposals, again, we're looking for creative ways to try to address both the governor's concern and the potential problems that come along with reallocating based on such system performance measures. Yeah, maybe that's all there is to say about that. But I will try to stick them in the chat in the next few minutes.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Tim. Appreciate
Sure.
you being here with us today, and all the information you shared. And as folks can see, please feel free to reach out to Tim or Genevieve or any of us at Housing California with any other questions you might have.
Perfect. Thanks.
That I know everyone's itching to also hear about the federal government, so I will transition us over to Kim at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thanks for being here, Kim.
Of course, thank you so much for having me, Chris, and hello, everyone. Like Chris said, I'm Kim Johnson. I'm the policy manager with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'm here to talk today a little bit about what's going on Capitol Hill and in the White House. I'll be honest, there are still a lot of things that are developing even as we speak. So if there are questions, I'm going to do my best to answer them. And if I don't know, I will also be honest about that. But without further ado, let's jump on in and get started. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the words of Marvin Gaye, what's going on? There is a lot to be paying attention to right now on the federal level. So just to kind of break down what we're going to be discussing. In Congress, they are eyeing a reconciliation package as well as need to tackle FY25 spending and to start an FY26 funding bill. And in the White House, of course, we have seen a number of executive orders on attacking diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, attacking trans rights and immigrant rights, and possibly soon an executive order around homelessness, ? But we'll talk more about that soon. And of course, there was the federal funding freeze that happened just two weeks ago, the end of January. It's hard to say. Everything runs together. Next slide, please. So to kick us off and talking a little bit about reconciliation, and I'm sure there are folks on this call who are familiar with the process, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, reconciliation is a legislative process that enables the relatively quick for Congress consideration of a bill by first limiting the kind of policies that can be included to only those that impact the federal budget, two, limiting debate time on a bill, and three, allowing a bill to pass the Senate with 51 votes instead of the 60 that are usually required in the chamber. So what's going on with reconciliation? There are two parallel tracks that the House and Senate are running on. So first in the House, they unveiled yesterday a budget resolution that proposes about $4 trillion in defense spending, spending for immigration enforcement, and extensions of the expiring provisions in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That resolution is also looking to cut about $2.5 trillion in mandatory spending programs, including Medicaid, nutrition assistance through the SNAP program, student loan relief, and rescinding some of the tax cuts that had been included in the Inflation Reduction Act passed, I think, just last year. For a timeline about the House reconciliation bill, they are marking it up in the Budget Committee today with a vote on the budget resolution in the full House by February 24th, at which point the committees of jurisdiction are going to go ahead and start drafting their bill text. Next slide, please. And then on over in the Senate, knowing that the House was facing a lot of troubles in getting their reconciliation package together, unveiled a skinny budget resolution last Friday that would fund defense and immigration enforcement, and that also proposes rolling back some IRA funding and some potential changes to SNAP and Medicaid that would ostensibly quote unquote save money, but I think that it's important to recognize that those cost saving measures those cost savings would be coming from kicking people off the program. For a timeline, the Senate Budget Committee marked up the resolution today in committee, and they are expecting a vote on the Senate floor on Tuesday. A vote expected in committee. Actually, it happened today, and then a vote on the Senate floor as soon as Thursday. Senate committees have been given until March 7th to draft the bill text for that skinny reconciliation bill. And if this passes, it would be the first of two potential reconciliation bills. President Trump has said that he wants, quote unquote, one big, beautiful bill to pass with all of his priorities, which is why the House is trying so desperately to reach an agreement on a huge spending bill. And the Senate, of course, is moving forward with their kind of two-pronged attack around reconciliation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So some important things to keep in mind about reconciliation. Reconciliation bills can only be used to change federal spending, federal revenues, or the federal debt limit. And so that spending and revenues includes mandatory spending around Medicare and Medicaid, military retirement, and SNAP. Changes to Social Security cannot be done through reconciliation. And historically, reconciliation has also not been used to provide funding or rescind funding from discretionary programs. So HUD programs are all discretionary. Agriculture and rural housing development programs also are discretionary programs. So it is very unlikely that we are going to see anything that would directly impact HUD programs included in this in either the House or Senate reconciliation bill, but we are definitely going to see cuts proposed to other programs that serve people with low incomes. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so most importantly, well, all of it is important, but the piece that I really wanted to flag are potential cuts to Medicaid in particular. We know that programs like SNAP and Medicaid have a huge impact on people with low incomes by helping people better afford groceries and medical care, which of course in turn leaves more room for them to cover housing costs. Medicaid can also be used to cover health-related social costs like housing. And so cuts to these vital programs are going to impact the same folks that we're advocating on behalf of. So people with the lowest incomes, people experiencing homelessness. The impact of these cuts is likely that we would see increased rates of evictions and potentially homelessness as a result of that. Next slide, please. So that was my last slide on reconciliation. I do want to say that it is a bit of a doom and gloom prospect. It feels very kind of like a caricature of politics to say that Republicans are working to cut funding to benefit programs and to extend tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, but that is unfortunately what's happening. And that's just kind of the long and short of like, this is what these bills are going to do, is cut funding to important social benefit programs in order to extend tax cuts and pay for additional defense or immigration enforcement spending. So looking at another piece of what Congress is tackling, FY25 and FY26, they of course have yet to finalize an FY25 spending bill. The current continuing resolution that we are right now operating under is set to expire on March 14th. And it's important to note too that both the House and Senate proposals for FY25 come up significantly short of fully funding HUD programs, including and especially the Housing Choice Voucher Program for voucher renewals. Our colleagues over at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities put out a study recently that looks at the impact at the funding shortfall for Housing Choice Voucher renewals. And they estimate that at the House level, which is essentially flat funding, is how little funding the House provided for voucher renewals, would result in about 750,000 fewer people being served by that program. While over in the Senate, it would result in about 136,000 fewer people being served by vouchers. It's important to note too that the House, the funding cut would be so steep that this wouldn't be vouchers lost through failure for financing to renew them. So this wouldn't just be vouchers that are lost because a family no longer needs it and there's not funding to renew the voucher and give it to a new family. In the House, it would likely be such significant cuts that people who are actively being served by those programs would lose their assistance. And I also included too the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. They have the broader report, but they also have a state-by-state breakdown of what that voucher loss would look like for each state. And so in California, it would be a reduction of about 44,400 fewer households served. And that translates to over 98,000 people who would be lose assistance under the House bill. Next slide, please. FY26 also starts on October 1st. We're expecting the president's budget request to be released in early April. And if passed as prologue, then we are expecting it to propose some pretty significant cuts across federal programs, including HUD and USDA, housing, homelessness, and community development assistance. During the last Trump administration, we saw proposals of between, I think it was 160,000 to 200,000 vouchers that would be lost if that funding level had been implemented. Congress is also going to need to address the debt ceiling before that October 1st FY26 deadline, well before it's likely that Treasury will release its estimations around extending extraordinary measures probably in June or July. And as a reminder to folks, the debt ceiling negotiations in 2023 led to the enactment of the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, which put in place really austere funding caps, which is part of why we are struggling now to fully fund so many programs. The good news of this is that Congress does need to reach a bipartisan agreement in order to enact these spending bills, which means that Democrats have leverage and can hold out in order to ensure that debt ceiling proposal is not tied to spending caps, in order to ensure that programs are getting adequate funding. And I think part of the advocacy ask is going to be ensuring that advocates remind Democrats that they have that leverage and need to use it in order to protect this vital federal funding. Next slide, please. And so, to that end, our priority within FY26 is going to be defending and where possible expanding investments in HUD's affordable housing and homelessness assistance programs. We are especially paying attention to, of course, housing choice voucher renewals, public housing maintenance operations and administration. We want to make sure that there continues to be funding for HUD's newer eviction protection grant program, as well as expanded funding for homelessness assistance and Indian Housing Block Grant and IHBG competitive programs. I'll say too, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this was an oversight when I was putting together my slides for you all last night. Conversations around disaster aid have kind of stalled. For a while, it sounded like they would be attached to the FY25 spending bill or another continuing resolution to extend FY25 funding again. those conversations have kind of dropped off, which is concerning. And I know that I don't need to tell folks on this call again, that there was also a lot of conversation from the president around conditioning the receipt of federal disaster aid to agreeing to certain conditions around immigration enforcement and other policies that the Trump administration disagrees with. Thankfully, there has been pretty round rejection of conditioning disaster aid from members of Congress. Disasters don't care about political lines, so setting a precedent of conditioning disaster aid would also have broad ramifications for Republican states as well. So there's pretty bipartisan rejection of that idea, but that is also definitely something that we're keeping an eye on. Next slide, please. Whew, so what's going on with the White House? I'm sure folks have seen again, there have been a number of executive orders that were released around diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility to undermine efforts to address historic and ongoing systemic racism and sexism and other policies, and to ensure a diverse federal workforce and ensure the enforcement of fair housing and civil rights laws. There's also a hiring freeze at federal agencies, and of course, the infamous fork in the road email that went around to a lot of federal employees, telling them that they can either resign or continue their work and risk getting fired. That executive order instituting the hiring freeze and encouraging people to leave the workforce is going to prevent HUD from hiring more staff, and it's going to likely slow down its ability to help states and communities address their urgent housing needs by slowing down the administration of funds or the provision of technical assistance. Next slide, please. There are also, of course, executive orders aiming to undo protections for LGBTQ people and especially trans people, which is going to lead to additional harassment and discrimination, housing instability, and unsheltered homelessness among people who are transgender, who are already more likely to face harassment, discrimination, housing instability, and unsheltered homelessness. And that, of course, is going to put their lives at risk. There are also executive orders targeting immigrant households that are essentially meant to scare immigrant families and communities, create fear, and deter immigrants from seeking assistance, even assistance to which they would otherwise be entitled. Next slide, please. And of course, there is the infamous OMB memo and federal funding freeze. For a recap of what happened at the end of January, on the 27th, the Office of Management and Budget issued a broad memo that would temporarily freeze funding for all federal grants and contracts. That came out, I think, the evening of the 27th, and the morning of the 28th, I got a very frantic phone call from one of my colleagues in the House Appropriations Committee saying essentially every HUD program is undergirded by some sort of a grant or contract. And so this funding freeze was ostensibly going to impact everything. Because of the broad nature of the memo, and thanks in large part to the advocacy of people like the folks on this call and people all around the country calling in and voicing their concern about what does this memo mean for me and my community and the people that we serve. Less than 48 hours later, the White House turned around and rescinded the memo. Then there was a very confusing tweet from the White House press secretary clarifying, quote unquote, that it is not a recession of the funding freeze, but rather of the OMB memo, ostensibly to end any confusion. That, of course, only created more confusion. Next slide, please. And so despite that memo never technically taking effect, it was frozen by a court order minutes before it was supposed to go into effect. Communities and organizations, the day the memo came out, the 28th, were reporting that their funding was frozen, and many are still reporting that they are still unable to access needed funds that have been appropriated. And if you're one of them, if you're working for an organization that is continuing to experience this, please let me know. Feel free to reach out. We're collecting those stories to send them to some of the lawyers who are bringing suits against the administration. And so anything that kind of evidence is like, hey, this is an ongoing issue and this has been the impact of this order, is very helpful, and we want to know about it. Like I said, the funding freeze is currently under 2 temporary restraining orders, one from a lawsuit brought by nonprofit organizations and the other from a lawsuit brought by 22 state attorneys general. There is a hearing for the nonprofit temporary restraining order next week on the 20th, and so we will see where this goes next. Next slide, please. We're also anticipating a potential executive order on homelessness. I mentioned that the Washington Post reported this week that we are expecting an executive order cracking down on crime in the district as well as encampments. Unfortunately, we also saw DC's mayor, Mayor Bowser, really immediately roll over and say, oh, the president is simply trying to beautify DC. I would argue DC is already a beautiful city, and that it is certainly not the people experiencing homelessness that are making it ugly. We have yet to see what the details of this are going to entail. We also have yet to see whether the scope is going to be just centralized to Washington, D.C., or whether it is going to try to impose some sort of a federal rule across jurisdictions or like across the country. We'll see. Next slide, please. And we are also anticipating the White House to continue pushing to limit access to housing and homelessness assistance. During the previous Trump administration, we saw a lot of pushing of Congress to enact burdensome requirements for people who need HUD assistance. So that includes things like work requirements, minimum rent increases, imposing time limits on people who are already receiving HUD assistance. The Trump administration also previously proposed to limit access to housing assistance for immigrant families, including families with mixed status immigrant households. And that rule would essentially mandate that households currently receiving HUD assistance who have mixed immigration status either give up the assistance that they need or evict their family member who does not have legal immigration status, which often is a parent or a grandparent. The current Trump administration also already ordered a halt on implementing and enforcing HUD's equal access rule, which essentially states that transgender people seeking access to homeless shelters should be able to receive services that are in line with their gender identity. There has already been a pause put on implementing and enforcing this rule, and we're expecting a more formalized attempt to roll it back, as again we saw during the previous Trump administration. Next slide, please. So where can advocates plug in? It is going to be more important than ever that members of Congress are hearing from you about the impact of what these proposals and potential funding cuts are having, what impact they're having on communities and neighbors, especially when it comes to cutting federal funding. Asking their elected officials, how will communities absorb the loss of these federal funds? Can they? What programs are not going to receive funding because they have to make up for this gap in federal funds? What is going to be sacrificed because of this? Letting members of Congress know that their decisions, both good and bad, have real consequences for their constituents means everything. A lot of the opposition to things like Medicaid cuts and SNAP cuts are getting discussed among Republicans behind closed doors. But having their constituents weigh in and say, hey, cutting Medicaid is going to really mess up my family, mess up like our financial situation. Having people weigh in does actually make a difference, even if they are not publicly voicing those concerns. We know that they are privately voicing them to leadership and to the White House. And so continuing that communication is really, really key. Next slide, please. I think this might be it for me. Yeah, that's it. I'm happy to answer questions. Again, I might not know the answer, but I'm happy to take a swing and get back to folks if answers emerge. But I'll hand it back on over to Chris.
Thanks so much, Kim, for all of that helpful information and sending our thoughts over to y'all in DC for on a variety of fronts. I'm actually gonna ask folks to throw questions in the Q&A, and then maybe Kim, if you have a moment to hang out and answer those through the Q&A so that we
Okay.
can maybe move to our next panel. If that sounds good to you. Cool. Well, with that, I'll invite all of our panelists to jump on. Awesome. Well, hi, everybody. We are going to be focusing this panel on the legislature and what's going on in the state legislature. And we've got some great panelists here with us today. And so I'll maybe ask them all to introduce themselves, starting maybe with Marina.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Marina Espinoza, and I'm the Policy Director for the California Housing Consortium.
And Anya.
Good morning, everybody. Anya Lawler with Public Interest Advocates. We are a lobbying and consulting firm in Sacramento that represents mission-driven organizations in the state capitol. We work on tenant rights, equitable development, and anti-displacement policy, mobile homes, etc. Good to be here.
Thanks, Anya. And over to Divya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Divya Shiv. I'm the Senior Policy Advocate of Homelessness Policy here at Housing California.
And Natalie.
Hey everyone, great to be with you all. I'm Natalie Spivak. I'm at Housing California and I'm our Senior Policy Advocate for Affordable Housing Production.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And our first question is just if you all each could share what you're seeing as key themes as we head into this legislative cycle and anything you're noticing. So maybe we'll start over same order we just did.
Hi, everyone. In terms of themes that we're seeing, I think that what's happening at the federal level and also what happened with the LA wildfires in January is influencing how the legislature is approaching the year. And I think the governor's budget proposal started to set the tone. While the governor didn't propose any investments in affordable housing programs beyond what's required by state law, he did put forward some sort of policy principles. And I think that was his way of inviting the legislature to explore some of those ideas. And those are around reducing costs, enhancing accountability, and promoting infill housing. And in terms of cost reduction efforts, I think folks are looking into permit streamlining approvals at the state agency level as well. And also there have been a few bills introduced around building standards and I think there's interest in seeing if there's an opportunity to reduce costs there. So those are some of the things I've been noticing in terms of themes.
Yeah, definitely agree that the federal administration and the LA fires have sort of really set a different tone than I think we maybe would have anticipated a few months ago in the legislature. On top of that, as folks may be aware, there's a significant number of new legislators. And so I would say that all of that together has made the start of the year probably more chaotic than it normally is as new members get their footing and as advocates get to know all the new members and really try to understand what priorities there are. I think too, there is still concerningly, I think still a frustrating frame that I think a lot of legislators buy into that really the solution to the housing crisis is just more production overall. And I think that unfortunately cuts against efforts to push for funding for affordable housing, because there's this belief that somehow if we just produce enough units, which we know we're never going to do, that we will magically create units affordable for very poor people. And so I think that's a dynamic that we have to figure out how to disrupt this year, and really convince legislators that money is needed to provide stability for low income folks, particularly in the face of an administration that obviously has low income people in the crosshairs.
Yeah, I'll second Marina and Anya, just the context with the wildfires, the federal government, and also the budget, the lack of investment in housing and homelessness, I think has played a really big role. And in homelessness policy, we're seeing bills around the need for funding and ongoing funding. And I think also an intersection between health and housing and health and homelessness, because health is where the money is flowing. So we're seeing a number of bills around Medi-Cal and using Medi-Cal to address homelessness needs, and mental health needs as well. And then while we haven't seen these bills be introduced yet, we are expecting to see a rise of bills that seek to arrest, cite, and fine individuals who are unhoused in public spaces. And again, I think this is coming from the federal government as well, but it's also a rising sentiment within California that it really looks at homelessness from a visibility perspective, that people should not be visible, rather than a systemic issue of why are there people who are unhoused and how can we address the root causes of homelessness. So that's something that we are expecting to see as bills continue to be introduced.
And I'll just add that I think that the wildfires have introduced a really interesting dynamic. Last year, with the affordable housing bond, we were kind of struggling to gain traction against other issues, like education and climate, all important, but housing kind of fell by the wayside after years of being a central focus in the legislature. But I think that we are seeing a renewed, really strong interest this year, both in speeding up the production of housing and also in potentially fighting more strongly for more resources, especially for LA. But I think there's an opening to really make the argument about why resources are necessary, which, as all of the speakers before us underlined, is incredibly important right now with dwindling bond resources and no budget resources in the governor's proposed budget. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
I'm wondering, Natalie, you just started on this topic, and so I'm open this up to anybody that wants to hit on this, but I'm curious if folks can speak to how the LA fires have really been impacting, both in terms of the legislative packages and, what legislators are focused on, as well as like the themes that are coming out this year and how those devastating fires are really impacting the ledge cycle and the budget cycle as well.
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think we saw pretty quickly that particularly LA area legislators wanted to pivot away from sort of like some of their plans for their bill packages and into bills that would both address sort of the direct impacts that the fires are having in Los Angeles County, but also sort of into longer term bills that are really sort of lessons learned and things that perhaps we should have in place for future disasters. I think the fires really exposed in a more obvious way a lot of the gaps that are in the law, and gaps in preparation for this type of disaster in a crowded urban area. We've seen both now the Assembly and the Senate have proposed some urgency legislation to try to address some of the most immediate impacts. And then there's probably a lot more bills coming that might be more longer term solutions. I think I will say, and this isn't meant as a dig on the legislature, I think it's all very chaotic. because people want to act with urgency, but also we're trying to grapple with really complicated questions about, how do we protect tenants? How do we deal with the fact that we just minted, 10,000 plus new renters in an already very strained rental market? And what impacts is that having not only on people displaced by the fires, but by people in the community writ large who are now under tremendous pressure? We've already seen, sort of a rise in evictions because people are evicting low-income tenants in favor of trying to rent to a higher income fire survivor, which is in theory a violation of, it's not in theory, it is a violation of Penal Code 396, but it's really, really challenging to enforce that at the scale that is needed. So, there's a lot flowing from that. And I think there's, maybe a bit of a desire for everyone to take a step back and stop rushing legislation and have more of a collective conversation about what are all the things that are needed and how do we get that done in a thoughtful way, knowing that a lot of these laws are going to not just impact the situation in Los Angeles, but are going to become permanent law that will be triggered in future disasters as well.
I think that's exactly right, that there's this real, sense of urgency and need to act immediately, but also a tension between wanting to do things that are long lasting. On the homelessness front, I think, we are all aware that the wildfires are going to exacerbate homelessness in the area, and people who are displaced are just at a higher risk of becoming unhoused. I think one thing that is not as much of a focus is the threat for people who were unhoused even before the wildfires, the health risks they experience, but also it's going to be that much harder for them to access permanent housing or even temporary shelter if the shelters are full because of the people who have been displaced. So I think that's something that, we're not hearing as much, although that could change. And we are hearing, a desire for more temporary shelters to be built. But again, I think while that's, helpful in theory, it's again that sense of urgency that could take years to be built, and it does divert attention away from permanent supportive housing, affordable housing, things that will really help in the long run as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think it's been interesting to listen to conversations change. I think we've actually kind of seen some issues being flipped on their head in terms of the way that the legislature, the administration had been talking about things and now are talking about things after the wildfires. So, for example, very hot topic right now is insurance, and this is broader than just affordable housing. It's the entire housing market. But what we're seeing since the wildfires or before the wildfires, I think the conversation was a lot surrounding concerns about rising premiums, whereas now there is more willingness to allow insurance companies to increase their premiums because there's so much fear that insurance companies will leave the state altogether, which I think for us, thinking about the insurance issues facing the affordable housing industry is really concerning because the insurance crisis has become an existential threat to many affordable housing developers who just aren't able to weather the increasing cost of premiums because they can't pass those costs on to their tenants in the way that market rate developers can. So it'll be really, I think it'll be increasingly important to figure out how to thread the needle around that narrative as we push for more systemic reforms to the insurance system for affordable housing. And then another example is with the Coastal Commission, which it's historically been difficult to build affordable housing and housing in the coastal zone more generally. And we saw the governor's executive order that removed the requirements for Coastal Commission review of rebuilding. And so just things like that, it'll be interesting to see how the traditional ways that state government has approached issues might change moving forward.
Awesome. I might move us to one more question. I know we're running short on time here, and again, folks, feel free to throw questions in the Q&A. I'm curious what y'all are working on this year in the legislature, and what priorities you all have for this legislative cycle.
I can get us started. And I mean, one of our top priorities again this year is budget advocacy and making sure that we can secure funding for affordable housing programs in the state budget. And so we're working with a number of folks probably on this call on that. And also, in terms of bills, the housing bond is a top priority for us as well. So really want to work to make sure that those bond measures move through the legislative process this year.
And I can speak to the homelessness bill priorities for Housing California. I'm working on two bills. One is on making Medi-Cal housing supportive services a benefit. These are services like housing navigation and housing deposit services, and actually making them a benefit so that we can draw down federal and state funding and reduce administrative burdens in accessing these programs, to make sure that more people can get these really important services. The second bill priority we're working on the homelessness side is reducing homelessness amongst the parole population for people who are re-entering their community. And we want to take an already existing program, the Adult Reentry Grant Program, and just make it more effective and efficient. And then obviously Housing California, yes, and we are still looking for authors for the reentry bill, but the Medi-Cal bill will be authored by Assemblymember Wicks. And we, Housing California, also are engaged in budget advocacy, specifically on the homelessness side, really advocating for the Homeless Housing Assistance Prevention Program. And we're also working on the housing bond as well.
You want to go, Natalie, or should I go?
Go for it. I'll go last.
So because we have so many different clients, we're working on a lot of different things, but I'll just focus on some of the tenant things that we have a role in. A lot of our work in the tenant space has shifted to sort of disaster related legislation. One of the big issues that has emerged in the wake of the fires is that there is a dispute about whether or not the law requires property owners to remediate toxic smoke and ash that is often left in the wake of urban fires. Because when you burn a bunch of houses and cars and things like that, naturally toxic stuff gets released. Some landlord groups are arguing that they're not responsible for that kind of cleanup. It's rendering units uninhabitable, but no public agency is being empowered to actually make that determination, and it's not clear whether or not tenants have to pay rent. So there's a lot of confusion, and it's just increasing housing instability for people whose houses are still standing, but they can't return to them because they're unsafe. And so we're going to do a bill to try to address that and clarify the law in that area. Also, a number of other emerging bills that would be triggered in the event of future disasters that impact housing to provide a broader scheme of tenant protections. That was one of the huge gaps we saw in the wake of this fire, is it immediately created tremendous instability throughout the entire region, and placed additional pressure, as I mentioned, on low-income renters. And there's not really been any action at all to protect folks. And so we think that that's a really big gap in the law that needs to be addressed. Also working on some changes to Penal Code 396, which is the provision of law that puts price gouging protections in place in the event of a disaster. We've seen a number of challenges with that, particularly that it only applies in the rental housing context for leases of 12 months or less. And so we've immediately seen a bunch of landlords requiring longer leases so that they can escape those provisions, so that they can gouge people displaced by the fires, which is unfortunate. Another bill that's being worked on by a large coalition is SB 52 by Sasha Renee Perez, who's from the Altadena area. This would prohibit the use of algorithmic price fixing in rental housing. Folks are probably familiar with this issue that a lot of large corporate landlords now use algorithms to dictate their pricing, which has really negative impacts on renters. Also, Senator Wahab is introducing a bill she may have already, I don't think she had as of yesterday, to give tenants what's known as the right to redeem. And what that means is that if a tenant gets served a non-payment eviction notice, as long as they can come up with the funds by the time the eviction process has ended, they can still get back into the unit. Right now, once a landlord serves a tenant with a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit, the tenant, after that 3 days, if they haven't come up with the rent, they're out of luck. Even if a month later, before all the court proceedings have ended, they have the money in hand. And there's often a lot of programs that can get tenants money to pay that rent, but tenants lose because we don't have a right to redeem, which many, many, many other states have. There's a handful of other ones, but I want to let Natalie talk because I know we're out of time.
Thanks, Anya. And I'll be really quick. I know that we're at time and folks are starting to drop off, but 3 things that I'll flag really quickly that Housing California is working on. One is looking at lessons learned from the 6th cycle housing elements in terms of local jurisdictions' implementation of affirmatively furthering fair housing and thinking about how we can strengthen and clarify affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements going into the 7th cycle. We're working on that with public advocates and the California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation. Second is we're working with enterprise community partners on a bill that would increase data transparency around the premiums that insurance companies are charging to affordable housing developers so we can better understand the problem and figure out longer-term systemic solutions moving forward. And then finally, we're working with a coalition of folks on reauthorization of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund program that's funded through cap and trade. It expires in 2030, and the governor has signaled that he wants that reauthorization to get done before he leaves office. So we're working with a coalition of transportation and environmental justice advocates who all benefit from those investments to advocate for a reauthorization that will meet all of our priorities. And I will say, for specific to housing, that is the program that funds the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program, which is a critical source of production funds for our community.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for that quick panel. And before we wrap, I'll just mention, as everyone probably heard a few times in this webinar, Housing California's biggest priority this year is the affordable housing bond from mentioned earlier from Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, and there is a companion bond in the Senate from Senator Chris Cabaldon. And those will be introduced next week. And excitingly, we will be hosting a launch for that for the effort behind those bonds next a week from today. And so I'm gonna hopefully this works in the chat. We are going to be hosting ongoing calls, probably monthly, that will provide updates and give people opportunities for action related to those bonds so we can build up the momentum in support of them this year. They're both $10 billion bonds that cover affordable production, supportive housing production, preservation, homeownership, addressing farm worker housing, tribal housing, and addressing homelessness. So hopefully everyone can please get involved and join us on those webinars. With that, I want to appreciate everyone that joined us here today, both on this panel and the other speakers earlier as well. And appreciate you all for joining us for this our quarterly town hall. Hopefully you all had a good time. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to myself or anybody on here and questions or feedback on these town halls writ large. We'd love to hear from you. With that, hope you all have a great day, and thanks again to all of our panelists.